Hi, my name is Dr. Katie Young. I'm a Principal Digital Health Scientist at SilverCloud Health, part of Amwell. We're here today to talk about loneliness and 5 things each of us can do to help solve the loneliness epidemic amongst young people. So the first thing I think, and one of the most important things, is to talk more about loneliness. Loneliness can be quite a taboo subject, but it's very normal to feel lonely from time to time. And I think it's important to acknowledge that it's okay sometimes to be alone. We've seen in the research that actually the relationship that we have between social isolation and loneliness, and even subsequent depression, is really affected by how we view being alone. We can view being alone as a positive opportunity, perhaps for self-growth or to have some time for ourselves, or we can view it more negatively as a social isolation and an experience of loneliness. So one thing we can really do to help is to normalize loneliness and talk more openly about all of the experiences we have with loneliness. The second thing we can do is to encourage social connectedness. The main theory of loneliness, why we experience it, is that it's actually an evolutionary adaptation that we experience loneliness to try and prompt us towards seeking more social connection. As a social species, we're very socially connected as humans. But it can be challenging to overcome the barriers to making those connections with other people. So encouraging others to maybe make the first move if they're interested in, meeting new people, thinking through the barriers and the challenges that we face with making those connections. And particularly, I think it's important to think about this now, post-pandemic. A lot of people are starting new jobs or new educational opportunities, perhaps in a remote setting, and that can make it even more difficult to make those close personal connections. So really encouraging and finding ways to get over those barriers to make connections is important. A third thing I think we can do is to kind of manage our expectations a bit around social connectedness. I think for all of us during the pandemic, it put into sharp focus the value that we place on our daily social interactions. And perhaps for many of us, we anticipated a sort of carefree return to very fulfilling social lives. There's a really interesting study actually came out looking at adolescents in Australia, showing that actually even though loneliness did increase from before to during the pandemic, the highest ratings of loneliness experienced by adolescents was actually in that period after the pandemic when we returned to social interactions. And one of the reasons this might be is that loneliness arises through a kind of discrepancy in our expectations versus our experiences of social connectedness. So it is important to remember that the social interactions and the relationships that we have can be complicated and perhaps not always as positive as we expect. But that doesn't take away from the value that we get from being with others. A fourth thing I think we can do is to understand that finding social acceptance may be harder for some people than for others. We're all different, and I think when we're growing up, particularly in adolescence, can become acutely aware of how different we are to each other. And it's very common to have feelings of not fitting in. I think this can be particularly challenging from individuals, perhaps from more marginalized groups in society or from minority communities who might find it more difficult to feel accepted in social situations. So it's really important that we all acknowledge these differences and make efforts to ensure that everyone does feel accepted and included in group settings. Finally, the fifth thing I think we can do is to encourage young people to seek additional support when they do need it. So loneliness, whilst I've talked about it as a very normal experience, it can become very chronic and very challenging for people in certain situations. And it often occurs alongside mental health problems such as anxiety and depression. Feelings of loneliness can really be compounded by the sorts of negative thoughts that we often experience in anxiety and depression. It can start to really affect our self-esteem and can create more barriers to being motivated to go and seek out new social connections. These types of thoughts and challenging behaviors can be effectively addressed through psychological interventions such as cognitive behavioral therapy, which can really help to address these symptoms of anxiety and depression. And often we see that when we treat the symptoms of anxiety and depression, the loneliness improves at the same time.